Okay. Will and when war makers became peacemakers. This paper presented in Europe in Euro conference, second International Syria conference, a decade of war on Syria and Syrian future trajectories. First of all, thanks to Dr. Mahmoul and thanks to the Center in Cambridge for giving me this time or this little time to participate. I believe that all believers in peace are looking for direct and real analysis and approach to tackle and solve a very complex crisis. This means that only the right question will lead to right analysis and finally breeds the right result. What's going on against Arab Syrian Qatar state is a link of a counter-revolution, capitalism against humanity in general and Arab Homeland in particular, which for 300 years has been taking place, i.e. since mercantilism, capitalism, industrial capitalism, imperialism, and globalism of today. The last decade, which is called Arab Spring, it is in fact both spring and fall as well, because people's sorry, because people's demand for change was quickly kidnapped by counter-revolution, taking into consideration that counter-revolution's forces are there latent under the skin of the ruling classes in the Arab countries. This is not the place or time to expand the analysis by reviewing developments, but only to refer to that while counter-revolution camp succeeds in most of Arab countries, the war and propaganda machine is oriented against Syria as the last castle of Arab nationalism. Since the very beginning of that war, the slogans and solutions of the Syrian crisis were endemic, i.e., counter-revolution camp succeeds in most Arab countries. The war and the propaganda machine is oriented against Syria as the last castle of Arab nationalism. Since the very beginning of that war, the slogans and solutions of the Syrian crisis were endemic, i.e., dividing Syria on sectarian, ethnic, religious basis. Democratize Syria through forces of politicized religion. Helping Syrian people through hundreds of thousands of terrorists into Syrian state from the colonial Turkish borders, financing, training, and arming the terrorists by Arab Gulf regimes who never allow inside their own countries any form of political parties to exist, suppress public freedoms and individual rights, and never adopt parliamentary, etc. And finally, all those forces and solutions have been produced in the Western capitalism's political and think tanks circles in what I call it the last Orientalism or the terrorist Orientalism history of the Western ruling classes, i.e., those of EU, USA, and Japan as the only non-European imperialism, and as all of them are the leadership of the counter-revolution time and again confirms that history is really a record or a process or record anti-process of a class struggle, while national, cultural, religious issues are mere covers of the fact that behind all wars is capital, and behind it human beings, i.e. capitalist classes, multinational corporations, and even individuals. In the core of all forms of wars against Syria is the interest of the Zionist Ashkenazi entity Israel, to be integrated into the Arab homeland in the form of integration through domination. As long as most of Arab rulers launch class wars against their own ruled people, subjugate to neo-colonialism, deliberately developing unequal development between Arab economies, normalizing with the Zionist Ashkenazi entity, Israel, either in secret or declared manner, then all evil forces must be devoted against the secular Syrian nationalist regime after the destruction of most of Arab republics and their armies and occupation of Iraq and Libya. A capitalist twist goes beyond the pioneer analysis of Edward Said in his Orientalism 1978 that the West recreates the Orient according to its own image. Said, inspired in fact by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto 1848, which states, it compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. In other words, it creates a world after its own image. Page 14 and published 1955. But the capitalist imperialist center is now telling us that either to accept the rulers who were we imposed on you, our colonial interest, exploitation, culture, or we will destroy every single home in Syria by various forms of wars, i.e. terrorists, direct US, UK, French, and Turkish occupation armies, supporting the Zionist part of the Syrian courts, and financed by Arab Gulf rental regimes. The West even export to Syria homosexuals to fight there, and the regimes and organizations of politicized religion from the Arab countries, especially the Gulf, export jihad al-nikah to Syria. And currently, US is stealing Syrian oil on the one hand and imposing economic war through Caesar's law on the other. On the top of all these wars, the West encourages continuous Zionist Ashkenazi entity Israel raids against Syria. If this picture is right, I wonder where and how both diplomatic routes can work, taking into consideration that the diplomacy never catch the ox from its horns. Even frankly, will it be right that the most of diplomatic interventions are coming from the same military and terrorist interventionists against Syria? Is this other than an insult of human intelligence? Let me elaborate. The last meetings on Syrian crisis with the participation of Turkey, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, all of those regimes are part of the various wars against Syria on the one hand, and very close friends and even cliently states of the United States regime on the other. That if ignore that all of them, I mean those countries, normalizing with the Zionist Ashkenazi entity Israel, which is a matter of fact, all the wars against Syria and Arab nations are devoted for that purpose. In parallel, or even more and before, both imperialist aggression goals against Arab homeland, which are one or a interests of stealing the wealth and capture Arab markets. What a unique and contradicted job to solve Syrian crisis by an alliance of enemies against Syria, i.e. the imperialist, Zionist, and Arab Islamic regimes of politicized religion on the one hand, and at the same time, they themselves are the gravel holders of peace for Syria. All of those are still occupy parts of Syria and fighting against Syrian state, each one by his own weapons. While Russia and Iran called by Syria, who invites the Chinese terrorists, Uyghurs, i.e., and all of the three forms of the above-mentioned aggressors. It is impossible that the same makers of terror are the maker of peace, especially in the same place and the same issue. While the capitalist parliamentary democracy is fading and scrapping in its motherland, the capitalist West, unfortunately, there is still there is no other tool to approach the Syrian crisis by other means at the moment. It is only the Syrian people who have the right to vote for their constitution on the one hand and to elect its representatives on the other. But both issues must be observed by missions from the south, east, and the west, and to confirm not from the west only. I saw with my own eyes on the streets of US and European cities millions of innocent people protesting against the war, against the US-UK rulers preparing war against Iraq 1990. But the regimes went forward, repeated their criminal war in 2003, and pushed it to its final crime with the spring fall on all Arab homeland. Millions of Arabs slaughtered, but war mongers, especially Bush Senior, Bush Junior, and Blair, who are now enjoying luxury life and might be considered as national heroes. Let the people vote for the secular constitution of one united Arab Syria. People's vote will be better way to know what people want and prefer. This will be the best test. Uncover the popularity of the regime, the real opposition, and the real joke of armed opposition, and even the so-called moderate armed opposition. Unbelievable. But to go to all these steps to solve Syrian crisis, all of us must ask the enemies to stop their wars against Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Syria were not a paradise democracy. Iraq, Libya, and Syria were not a paradise of democracy before terrorist wars, but how they are now after the paradise was imposed by wars of terrorist Orientalism. To go back to the first line of this paper, the counter-revolution three camps, imperialism, Zionism, and Arab too fragile elites, the ruled political rulers and the intellectuals of the 6th Brigade were and still are, all of those are against A, Arab Central United State, B, and against the cause of a uniting Arab and the liberation of Palestine. To block those two great Arab goals, the counter-revolution must attack Syria. Thank you.